I was just an old woman everyone called forgetful until the night my granddaughter whispered a secret that could have cost us both our lives. When they locked me in the basement and told her I'd never come back, I made one final promise I would find a way to save her, even if it meant carving the truth into the walls with my own blood. If you think you know how this ends, you don't. Stay with me until the very last word, because this story proves that the quietest voice in the room can change everything. If you believe no child should ever be silenced, tap subscribe now to stand with us. Leave a comment telling me you're listening, and share this video so no one else has to suffer alone in the dark. My name is Martha Collins, and that Thanksgiving night started like any other in my son's house. The kitchen smelled of sweet potatoes and roast turkey, the kind of scent that almost tricks you into believing a family is whole. But the truth was, we were never really whole. I'd learned that long before Sophie came along. I was sitting at the far end of the table, the spot they always left for me, like I was some piece of old furniture they couldn't decide to keep or throw away. Everyone was talking over each other, Lauren gushing about her new job, Derek bragging about the truck he'd leased my son Kyle, trying to keep peace by refilling everyone's wine glasses. Nobody looked at Sophie. Nobody noticed how quiet she'd become these past few months. When she finally climbed onto the bench beside me, she didn't say hello. She just pressed her tiny hand against my arm so light I almost didn't feel it. She leaned close enough that her warm breath tickled my skin, and in the smallest voice I have ever heard, she whispered, "Grandma, it hurts when I have to hug him." My heart stopped. For a second I thought I'd misheard, but when I looked at her, I saw those big brown eyes shimmering with something more than just shyness. They were asking me to believe her. So I did. I cleared my throat and repeated as calmly as I could, "Sophie says it hurts when she hugs Derek." The laughter that followed cut deeper than any knife. Lauren slapped her palm on the table, nearly spilling the gravy. "Oh, for God's sake," she said with that cold little laugh she'd perfected since her divorce. "She's making up stories again. She probably bumped her arm or something." Derek's smile never reached his eyes. He just stared at Sophie across the mashed potatoes, that same look I'd caught him giving her when he thought no one was watching. My skin prickled, and for a moment, the whole room felt too small to breathe in. I tried again, softer this time. "Honey, do you want to tell Mommy what you told me?" Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. She just shook her head and stared down at her plate. Lauren rolled her eyes. "She's 6, Mom. She lies. She doesn't know what she's saying. Maybe everyone else could pretend that was true. But I knew. In my bones, I knew. Because I'd heard that same small voice once before, years ago, when Lauren was little and scared of a man nobody believed could hurt a child. And I remembered exactly what it cost me to stay silent. That was the moment I decided this time I would not be silent. Not for anyone. After that Thanksgiving night, nobody mentioned Sophie's whisper again. The next morning, Lauren acted like nothing had happened. She poured her hazelnut coffee, scrolled through her phone, and chatted about Cyber Monday sales as if her daughter hadn't tried to tell us something that could shatter all of us. But I couldn't forget. I started paying closer attention, not just in the big moments, but in all the little ones people like Lauren never noticed. When Sophie came home from school, she would linger by the doorway, her backpack still on, watching to see if Derek was in the living room. If he was, she'd slip past him with her head down, her tiny shoulders pulled up around her ears like she was trying to disappear. That Friday evening, while Lauren was out with her friends, she called it her self-care time, I offered to help Sophie with her reading. She climbed onto the couch beside me without a word, clutching a piece of folded paper. Her hands were trembling. "Can I look at it, sweetheart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from cracking. She nodded and passed it to me. Inside was a drawing done in thick black crayon. A little girl with brown pigtails sat on the floor of what looked like a closet. Next to her was a tall figure, a man whose face she hadn't drawn at all, just a blank oval. Over his head she'd written in crooked letters, "He says secrets are safe." I traced the letters with my fingertip, feeling my stomach twist. "Sophie, when did you draw this?" "Yesterday," she whispered. "But you can't tell. He said if I tell, I'll have to go away." I took her small hand in mine, and for a moment the old fear came flooding back, the same fear I'd felt decades ago when Lauren was little, and told me about the uncle who liked to tickle her when no one was around. Back then, I'd been too scared to believe her, too scared to stand up to the family that insisted it was all in her head. I would not fail this child the way I'd failed her mother. I believe you. I told Sophie, and I meant it with every last piece of me. Later that night, after Lauren came home smelling of wine and laughter, I watched from the hallway as Sophie pretended to be asleep on the couch. Derek walked past her, and even in the low lamplight, I saw her whole body flinch. Nobody else saw it. Nobody cared enough to look, but I did. Standing there, my hand pressed flat to the wall to keep myself steady, I promised myself and her that I would never look away again. I didn't know exactly how I would protect her yet, but I knew this much: the next time she whispered the truth, I would be ready to listen and ready to act. After Sophie handed me that drawing, there was no turning back. I knew I had to do more than watch. I had to prove what was happening when the rest of the house turned their eyes away. The very next morning, I drove my old Buick down to the hardware store on Main Street. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my purse at the register. I told the young clerk I needed a small camera, something easy to hide. He showed me a little nanny cam shaped like a stuffed bear. I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of it like a stone. "You sure this is the one you want, ma'am?" he asked kindly. I nodded. "Yes, it's the one." When I got home, I tucked the camera into the crook of my arm and carried it upstairs to Sophie's room. My heart thudded against my ribs so hard, I thought it might bruise me from the inside, but I kept moving. I propped the bear on the shelf across from her bed, angled its black button eyes toward the doorway. Every motion felt like a confession, like I was finally admitting that this was real. That evening, while Lauren and Derek sat in the den watching television, some show with too much yelling and too little humanity, I asked Sophie if she wanted me to read to her before bed. She nodded, her small face pale under the lamplight. When she climbed under the quilt, I pulled it up to her chin and smoothed her hair back. "If you get scared, you can come downstairs to Grandma any time," I told her softly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment she looked relieved. But later that night, I stood behind the half-closed door to her room and listened to Derek's footsteps creak up the stairs. I held my breath. I counted each step. When he reached the doorway, the hallway went quiet. Too quiet. I didn't move. I didn't dare open the door. The next morning, while everyone was gone, Lauren at work, Derek running errands, I retrieved the camera and carried it to the basement like it was something alive and dangerous. My hands were so unsteady, I had to set it on the laundry table just to catch my breath. When I played back the video, I felt a part of me shatter. The recording showed Derek entering Sophie's room just after midnight. He didn't turn on the light. He walked straight to the bed and leaned over her. Even without sound, I could see the way she froze under the blanket, how she turned her face to the wall, how he reached for her. I pressed the stop button. My thumb was white from gripping the remote. I knew then that I couldn't pretend this was something she might outgrow or forget. No child forgets terror that raw. I copied the video onto a flash drive and labeled it in block letters, "Proof." Then I wrapped it in a plastic sandwich bag and hid it inside an old tin my late husband used to keep screws and nails. That night, when I tucked Sophie in again, she reached for my hand. Her voice was a whisper so fragile, it barely reached my ears. "Did you see?" I swallowed hard. "I saw enough. Can you make it stop?" she asked. My throat burned. "I promise you I will." Downstairs, I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight staring at that flash drive. I felt old and tired and scared in a way I hadn't felt since Lauren was little. But there was something else under the fear, something steady and fierce. I was done letting this family pretend nothing was wrong. I was done being the quiet one. From that moment on, every single day was a step toward the truth. And no matter how much it cost me, I knew I would never look away again. In the days after I hid the flash drive, I thought I was doing a decent job pretending to be normal. I still baked cornbread on Sundays and folded the laundry neatly just the way Lauren liked it. But every time Derek's truck rumbled up the driveway, I felt my stomach clench like a fist. I'd always known this couldn't stay secret forever, but I hadn't expected the moment it would all come apart to be so quiet, so ordinary. That Thursday evening, Lauren was in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of red wine. Derek was sitting at the counter, scrolling on his phone, a smirk planted on his face like it belonged there. Sophie was upstairs coloring in the corner of her room where she felt safest. I was carrying a basket of folded towels when I heard the ping of Lauren's phone. She picked it up, squinting at the screen. Her lips parted. "What's this?" she asked sharply. Derek lifted his gaze. "What's what?" She held up the phone, her voice rising. "Did you email me some file?" "It says proof." My heart stopped. I hadn't sent anything to her. But I had emailed my lawyer, Mr. Mitchell, attaching the video clip I'd copied from the camera. My hands began to shake and the towels nearly slipped from my arms. Derek stood up slowly, too calmly. "Let me see that." He took the phone from her hand. His eyes scanned the screen. The muscles in his jaw tightened. "Who sent this?" Lauren demanded, her voice brittle with confusion. Derek turned to me, his gaze like a blade. "You did, didn't you?" I swallowed, willing my voice to be steady. "I don't know what you're talking about." He stepped closer, the air between us stretching tight as wire. "You think you're clever? Spying on us?" Lauren's face went pale. "Mom, what did you do?" "I did what you wouldn't," I said, my voice trembling but louder than I'd expected. "I protected Sophie." For one split second, nobody moved. The house felt as if it had been vacuum-sealed, all the oxygen sucked out. Then Derek lunged. His hand clamped around my arm so hard I gasped. He ripped the basket of towels away, sending cloth fluttering across the kitchen like frightened birds. "You think you can ruin my life?" he hissed. "You already ruined it yourself," I shot back. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Lauren stepped between us, her voice shaking. "Stop it, both of you." But Derek wasn't listening. He grabbed my wrist and twisted it until I cried out. My vision blurred with pain. "You're going to erase that video," he snarled, "and you're going to keep your mouth shut." I tried to pull free, but he shoved me backward. My hip struck the corner of the counter so hard I thought something had cracked. I fell to my knees. Mom Lauren screamed. But she didn't come closer. She just stood there, her hands pressed to her mouth like she couldn't decide whether to help or pretend she hadn't seen. I forced myself to look up at Derek's face. I wanted to remember every line, every shadow. If I was going to be afraid of this man, I needed to see exactly who he was. "You can break me," I whispered, "but you will not break her." His eyes flashed. Then he leaned down so close I could feel his sour breath. "We'll see about that." He grabbed my shoulders and hauled me up. Pain lanced down my side, but I didn't cry out again. I refused to give him that satisfaction. He dragged me through the kitchen, past the hallway, where Sophie's little shoes were lined up in a perfect row. I stared at those shoes and felt something inside me go cold and sharp, like a blade forged in the dark. Derek opened the basement door and shoved me toward the steps. My foot slipped on the top stair, and for a heartbeat I thought I was going to tumble all the way down, but I caught myself gripping the banister with both hands. "Don't you dare touch her again," I rasped. He didn't answer. He slammed the door behind me so hard the walls rattled. I heard the deadbolt slide into place. For a long moment I just stood there in the dark, breathing raggedly. My hip throbbed, my wrist burned. But it was the silence that hurt the most, the way the house above me carried on muffled voices and footsteps like nothing had happened. I sank down onto the cold concrete floor, pressing my palm flat to my chest to feel the thud of my heartbeat. I was still alive, and as long as I was alive, I could fight. Above me, I heard Sophie's voice, thin and scared. "Where's Grandma?" No one answered her. I closed my eyes and whispered to the darkness, "Hold on, baby. I'm not finished yet." The first hour in that basement felt like an eternity. My hip was bruised so badly I could hardly sit upright. The cold from the concrete seeped straight into my bones. I pressed my back against the shelves lined with old paint cans and Christmas ornaments we hadn't used in years, trying to stay conscious. Above me, muffled voices drifted down. I heard Lauren crying, though whether she was crying for me, for herself, or just for the ruin of her perfect little world I couldn't say. I heard Derek's voice, low and hard, barking instructions I couldn't make out. Then all at once the house went quiet. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath fogging in the darkness. I tried to keep count of the minutes, but they slipped through my mind like water through a cracked cup. My body ached in ways I hadn't known it could ache. But the worst pain came from thinking of Sophie upstairs, wondering why no one answered her questions. When I finally forced myself to look around, my eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the small basement window. That was when I remembered the old tin lunchbox my husband had used when he worked at the mill. It was wedged on a shelf above my head, half hidden behind a box of frayed extension cords. I pulled myself up inch by inch. Every movement made me gasp, but I didn't stop. My fingers closed around the handle and I dragged it down onto my lap. Inside were only rusted screws, a strip of duct tape, and a bent wire hanger. I stared at the hanger for a long moment. Then, with trembling hands, I twisted it open until I had a jagged piece of metal sharp enough to leave a mark. I pressed the tip against the wall. The concrete was rough under my palm. My heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. "Help Sophie." I scratched slowly. The letters came out crooked, shaky. My vision blurred with tears I couldn't wipe away. But I kept going. Derek did this. I didn't know if anyone would ever see it. Maybe the police would come too late. Maybe Lauren would pretend she'd never known. But if anyone ever found this basement, they would know I hadn't just disappeared. I hadn't given up. My arm went numb halfway through the last word. I sank back to the floor, the hanger slipping from my fingers. My breathing sounded ragged in the darkness. "Grandma!" The voice came faint and quivering through the gap under the door. My throat closed around a sob. "Sophie!" I croaked. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to tell." "No, baby," I said, my voice breaking. "You were brave. You did the right thing." I pressed my hand flat to the door, wishing I could touch her hair, wipe the tears from her cheeks. "I'm going to get you safe," I promised, "no matter what it takes." There was a long silence. Then I heard Lauren's voice, brittle and exhausted. "Sophie, go to your room." A little sob. Footsteps. The click of a lock turning again. Then nothing. I closed my eyes and pressed my palm to the cold floor, feeling the slow thump of my heartbeat. Even in that darkness, even with my body failing me, a single thought burned bright and sharp as a brand. This wasn't the end. Not if I had anything left to give. The next morning, the basement door didn't open. No footsteps, no voices. Only silence so heavy it felt alive. My body ached from the cold and the bruises. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sign that Sophie was all right. Hours passed that way, me drifting in and out of something like sleep, only to jolt awake every time the old furnace kicked on. I thought about all the things I hadn't said, all the ways I had failed to protect my daughter when she was small. I thought about Sophie's little voice whispering, "I didn't mean to tell." And then, faint as a breath, I heard the front door open and close, tires crunching on the driveway, the engine fading down the street. They were gone. I didn't know for how long, but even that thin chance felt like a miracle. Upstairs, Sophie moved around the living room. I could picture her barefoot clutching her stuffed rabbit the way she always did when she was scared. My sweet girl. She deserved a childhood that wasn't shadowed by fear. I forced myself to sit up. My hips screamed in protest, but I couldn't afford to be weak. Not now, not when she might be planning something brave. It must have been around noon when I heard the tiniest knock on the basement door. "Grandma?" "I'm here, baby," I rasped. "They're gone," she whispered. "I have to go to school now." I swallowed against the lump in my throat. "It's okay. You be brave. You remember what we talked about?" She was quiet so long I thought she'd slipped away. Then in that trembling little voice she said, "I remember." That was all she needed to say. I didn't know what plan she'd made in her mind, but I trusted her more than I'd ever trusted anyone. Hours later, though it felt like days, I heard the car pull back into the drive. Doors slammed. Laughter drifted through the walls. It was almost obscene how normal they sounded. But I clung to the last thing Sophie had said. I remember. Somewhere deep in my chest, hope flickered again. Maybe this time someone would listen. And as darkness settled over that basement one more time, I pressed my palm to the cold concrete and whispered, You did the right thing. Because even if I couldn't see it yet, I believed help was finally on the way. I don't know how long I drifted in that dim place between sleep and waking. Hours blurred together, broken only by the groan of the furnace or the scrape of a chair above my head. My body had begun to betray me. My hip ached so badly I thought I'd be sick. My tongue felt like dry paper in my mouth. But what scared me most was the fear that maybe Sophie hadn't been able to do anything, that maybe my last hope had slipped away when she closed the door behind her. By dusk, I had almost convinced myself that nothing would change, that Derek and Lauren would go on pretending I'd left on some confused errand and simply never come back, that Sophie would be told I'd abandoned her, and eventually she'd believe it. Then, sometime after the last light faded from the basement window, I heard it a pounding on the front door so hard it rattled the walls. My heart stuttered in my chest. Voices followed deep, commanding voices I didn't recognize. Sheriff's Department. Open the door. I tried to sit up, but the pain made my vision spin. From upstairs, Derek shouted something, his voice tight and furious. Lauren's voice joined his shrill and panicked. A scuffle, a thud. Then the sound I had dreamed of, boots on the stairs. The basement door swung open so fast it hit the wall with a bang. Blinding light poured down the steps. I lifted my hand to shield my eyes, squinting against the brightness. A man in a deputy's uniform ran toward me, his radio crackling. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I nodded weakly. My throat wouldn't make words, so I just lifted a trembling hand. "We've got her," he said into the radio. "She's alive. Alive." The relief was so sharp it made me sob. I hadn't realized until that moment how sure I'd been that I would die in that room. 2 more deputies came down with a stretcher. I tried to protest. I didn't want to leave without seeing Sophie, but my voice broke. The younger deputy knelt beside me and touched my shoulder gently. "Your granddaughter is safe," he said. "She showed her teacher something this morning. That's why we're here." Sophie, my brave, precious girl. Tears filled my eyes as they lifted me onto the stretcher. As they carried me up the stairs, I caught sight of Lauren in the living room, her face pale and streaked with tears. Derek stood beside her in handcuffs, his eyes locked on the floor. I didn't look away. I wanted them both to see my face, wanted them to remember that no matter how hard they tried to bury the truth, it had clawed its way to the surface. As the paramedics rolled me out into the cold night air, I turned my head just enough to see Sophie standing beside a woman in a dark jacket. The woman's arm was around her shoulders. Sophie's eyes were red from crying, but when she saw me, she lifted her hand and gave me the smallest, bravest wave. That was the moment I knew we'd both survived. Not by luck, not by accident, by love and by refusing to stay silent. They kept me overnight in the hospital. My hip was badly bruised and the doctor worried about dehydration, but I hardly noticed the ache in my body. All I could think about was Sophie. The nurse told me she was safe with Child Protective Services for the night and that she'd asked if I was coming back for her. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Tell her grandma's not going anywhere." When the morning sun slipped through the blinds, I felt something I hadn't in months: certainty. No more waiting, no more doubting my instincts. I knew exactly who Derek was. I knew exactly what Lauren had chosen to ignore. By the end of the week, charges were filed, multiple counts of child endangerment and abuse against Derek, and accessory and obstruction against Lauren. My lawyer, Mr. Mitchell, arrived with a stack of documents so thick I thought it might crush the little rolling table by my bed. "This will be hard," he warned me gently. "They will try to call you confused, to say you imagined things. But we have your recordings. The video from that night, Sophie's drawings, her statements to her teacher." I nodded. My hands were still bruised and shaky, but my voice was clear when I said, "It's enough." On the day of the hearing, the courthouse was colder than I remembered any building ever being. The long hall smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant, like no one could scrub out the sadness that lived in those walls. I sat with Mr. Mitchell at the front. When they brought Derek in, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles around his wrists, he didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. Lauren followed behind him, her hair pulled back in a trembling little knot, her face blotchy with tears that might have been real or might have been for show. When the judge called my name, my heart thudded so hard I thought everyone in that hushed room could hear it. "Mrs. Collins, the judge, said you may make a statement." I stood carefully, my cane in one hand and a folder in the other. I met Lauren's eyes first. "You laughed when she told you she was hurting," I said, my voice steady. "You called her a liar. You called me crazy. But we were neither." Then I turned to Derek. My hand tightened on the cane. "She drew you faceless because she was too scared to give you one. But I see you now." He looked down, but I didn't stop. "You thought no one would believe her. You thought no one would fight for her. You were wrong." I handed the folder to the clerk. Inside were copies of Sophie's drawings, the recordings I'd hidden in the old tin, the video from the hidden camera. Proof that neither of us had been imagining monsters in the dark. The judge read every page in silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was as cold as the air in that courtroom. "Mr. Mitchell," she said to Derek, "you will be held without bail." "Miss Collins, I commend your courage. Sophie will remain in protective care until permanent guardianship is decided." I closed my eyes. For the first time in a long while, my heart felt light enough to beat without pain. This wasn't over yet, but the truth was finally louder than the lies. After the hearing, I spent 2 more nights in the hospital under observation. Every hour felt like a test of patience I wasn't sure I had left in me, but each time the nurse brought me an update. "Sophie is safe. Sophie is asking about you." Sophie drew you a picture. It was like someone slipped a warm blanket over my shoulders. When the paperwork was finally done and the judge signed the guardianship order, I held that paper in my hands until the ink nearly smudged. I'd thought I would feel triumphant, but all I felt was relief so deep it hollowed me out. We didn't go back to that house. I didn't want Sophie to ever again see the door to the basement or the hallway where she'd learned to flinch. Instead, we stayed at a shelter for 2 weeks while Mr. Mitchell helped me secure a small rental cottage in Vermont. It wasn't much, just a 2-bedroom with faded shutters and a narrow porch, but it felt like freedom the moment I stepped onto the creaky floorboards. Sophie walked through every room in silence, her stuffed rabbit pressed tight to her chest. When she reached the little kitchen, she turned to me with that solemn look she'd worn since the night they took Derek away. "Is this our house?" she asked. I crouched down, ignoring the ache in my hip. "Yes, baby, ours, no one else's." That was the first time I saw her smile without fear. We settled in slowly, piece by piece. I found a second-hand table and 2 chairs. I unpacked the quilts I'd stored away for years. I hung Sophie's drawings on the refrigerator with bright magnets shaped like sunflowers. Every morning I baked something small: corn muffins, biscuits, blueberry scones, because it made the little house smell like safety. One afternoon, Sophie came to me with a fresh sheet of paper. Her hands were clean for once, no marker smudges on her fingers. "Grandma," she said, holding it out, "I made this for you." I unfolded it carefully. She had drawn 2 people standing side by side, in front of a yellow house with a crooked chimney. One was tall, with gray hair. The other was small, with brown pigtails. Over the roof, she'd written in purple crayon, "We are safe here." My throat tightened. I blinked fast, but the tears came anyway. "It's beautiful," I whispered. "Can we put it on the wall so we don't forget?" She nodded, and for the first time her shoulders didn't hunch. She stood tall beside me while I taped it up above the stove. That night, as I tucked her into her new bed, she asked, "Will we have to leave this house?" I brushed her hair back from her forehead. "No, sweetheart. This is our home now. No one can make us leave." She closed her eyes, her little hand still wrapped around mine. I lay awake long after she drifted off, listening to the soft hum of the old refrigerator and the winter wind tapping at the windows. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for footsteps on the stairs. This was how healing began, not with grand declarations, but with small, steady promises kept one morning at a time. Spring came early in Vermont that year. By March, the snow had melted off the porch steps, leaving little patches of damp wood where Sophie liked to sit and draw. She had a box of fresh crayons, every color she could name, and she spent hours sketching pictures of us, 2 figures, holding hands under a sky full of bright, impossible stars. Every Sunday morning, I lit a small white candle in the kitchen. I didn't tell Sophie exactly why. I suppose it was my way of marking all we'd survived, of promising her we would never go back to the dark. One quiet evening, as I washed the last of the supper dishes, she came up behind me and slipped her arms around my waist, her cheek pressed against my back, warm and certain. "Grandma," she said softly, "will you always hear me?" I turned off the tap and dried my hands before I faced her. "Always," I said, "even if I'm old and tired, even if my hair turns all white, even if I'm not right here beside you." Her eyes searched mine as if she were measuring whether that promise could ever break. I rested my palm over her small, steady heartbeat. "You never have to be afraid to tell me the truth," I whispered, "because you are never alone." That night, after she was asleep, I sat by the window watching the last pale light fade across the trees. The little house smelled of cinnamon and soap. My heart was still bruised in places I didn't know how to mend, but for the first time I believed we were going to be okay. Sometimes late at night I remember the darkness of that basement. I remember the cold concrete under my palms and the certainty that no one would come. But then I think of Sophie standing brave in her classroom, pressing that folded drawing into her teacher's hand. She had saved me as much as I saved her. If you ever doubt that a small voice can change everything, remember this: when one person dares to speak and another dares to believe, a whole new life can begin. If there's one truth I carry with me after everything, it's this: silence never protects the people we love. For years, I believed that staying quiet was the safest way to keep the peace, to avoid conflict, to pretend the cracks in my family weren't growing wider every day. But the moment Sophie whispered that she was hurting, I knew silence was the most dangerous choice of all. No matter how old we are, no matter how tired, we have the power to stand up and say, "This isn't right." We can be the voice that believes a frightened child. We can be the person who listens when no one else will. And in doing so, we prove that courage doesn't always look like loud declarations. It often sounds like a steady promise whispered in the dark: "I will not let you face this alone." If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own strength, I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in protecting the vulnerable, please subscribe to this channel. Together, we can make sure no one's voice gets lost in the silence again.